And greetings, saints of the Most High. Welcome to the Messianic Torah Observer's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections. I'm Rod Thomas, and I want to thank you for fellowshipping with me here on this blessed day of rest. For it is here, beloved, that we gather every Shabbat to delve into Jehovah's eternal words of life, his instructions in righteousness, which is our constitution and the very foundation for our covenant relationship with the Creator of the universe. And as always, it is our hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections finds you, your families, and fellowships well and blessed. So how are you all doing today? I'm happy to be here fellowshipping with you today, looking at, studying, examining, thinking, and reflecting on Yah's instructions in righteousness, our Torah reading that we do every week as Abba allows. As we are recording and posting this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer, number 48 in our 3-year Torah reading cycle, we've just entered the 6th biblical month of Yah's biblical calendar year. And for many, that won't mean a single thing. But for those of us who are in sync and in tune with Yah, it is important. Yah's reckoning of time is extremely important because Yah's reckoning of time outlines and frames for us the days, the times, the seasons in which he has set apart to meet with us, to commune with us, to be with us, to teach us, to grow us. Oh, well, Rod, under the renewed covenant, under the new covenant, every day is a Sabbath. Every day is a feast or holy day. It doesn't matter. Well, yeah, I beg to differ. Because these seasons and times were set apart at the very foundation, the creation of this earth, the universe, everything that is there, out there. Yah set this up from the very beginning. And he instituted this in our Torah. So yes, we as Messianics, note sorry, even Hebrew rooters, if you want to go down that old kind of route, I've kind of moved towards the note sorry, note sarim, or the Messianic side of things, even though it's really kind of hard to classify and title ourselves. It's still important, brethren, to know how Yah, his timing, what Yah's timing is in his great plan of salvation, restoration, and redemption. So as I'm recording and posting this, we've entered the 6th biblical month. We began that at the beginning of this week, the second day of this week. And I did posting, Rosh Chodesh for the 6th month. If you haven't had a chance to listen to this, it's not too late to go back and listen to that. Well, it wasn't a brief posting, but I'm going to start doing that as Abba allows, posting every new moon sighting, just so that we're all on the same page. As the days grow darker and dimmer, I just really want to be in tune with Yah's ways, all of his ways, not just digging more into Scripture, which is something that we all must engage in and purpose within our very being to do. To delve into Yah's word more than we've ever done as we prepare for the dark days ahead, as the end times most certainly are upon us. I know this has been, we're at the end times, has been touted and put forth and proclaimed by many brethren throughout the centuries. Every so often there are events and things and cycles that happen, and we're just almost certain that these are the end times at those times. World War II, World War I, and other monumental times throughout history. bring us to these beliefs and thoughts that we're at the end of days, that we're in the end times. But at least as far as I'm concerned, I should say, it sure seems that we're in some dark days. If not the end of days, these are some dark days, and we need to be even closer to Yah. So with this sixth biblical month, and I mentioned this in the posting on Rosh Chodesh, we really have just less than a month. We have like 3 weeks before the fall feast of Yah begin. And for those of you who are new to our faith community, the Feast of Yah are some of the most important elements of Torah living that we engage in as Yah's elect. And in the fall feast, we have the Feast of Trumpets coming up in 3 weeks, or Yom Teruah. And then 10 days later, we have Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. And then 5 days after that, we have Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a 7-day feast, followed by one single last great day, or Shemini Atzeret. So we've got a huge month coming upon us. And I said it also in that post, if you've not made plans and made provisions to participate in these fall feasts, in particular, Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, that 8-day period, where we are under the understanding, we have the understanding that we're supposed to uproot ourselves and Sukkot with other like-minded brethren to celebrate and worship this wonderful time of Yah's biblical calendar year. So we just finalized our Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, and we're looking forward to that. We're going to be fellowshipping with some wonderful brethren over in the Tennessee area, and we are greatly looking forward to that. It was touch and go for a while because the original plans we had for Sukkot, well, they fell crashing through. So we are happy to have been able to squeeze into this feast site, and it is, that's literally a month. Well, it's not a month away. We've got a little over a month to go before the Feast of Sukkot hits. But if there's anything I can say to you today, let's get prepared. Let's get prepared to receive the months and to engage in the months to make these fall feasts the best feast celebrations we've ever had. And that's all I really want to say in terms of housekeeping. And with that, what do you say we get into Yah's word for today? This is entitled, this discussion, this reading is entitled, Even the Small Things Matter to God. Even the small things matter to God. And this is the 48th reading of our 3-year Torah reading cycle. And it is contained in Exodus, Shemot, chapter 4, verses 14 through chapter 6, verse 1. But fear not, we're not going to be getting into 2 chapters today. We're going to focus only on verses 22 through 26 of the 4th chapter. So Exodus chapter 4, verses 22 to 26. Now, looking back a week ago to Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections number 47, which I entitled God's Holy Character, and it was a messianic study of Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through chapter 4, verse 14. And if you've not had the opportunity to check out that Torah reading discussion, I would humbly encourage you to do so. And if you go on over to the MessianicTorahObserver.org, the MessianicTorahObserver.org, you'll find that I have the link to, I have posted in this post. I have recorded in this post the link to that discussion, or just simply look for that title, God's Holy Character, a Messianic Study of Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, chapter 4, verse 14, and you'll find it. This posting builds on Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections number 47. It's a continuation of this story. And in that discussion, last week's discussion, we talked about Moshe's commission. Moshe's commission, which included Yah revealing to him, Moses, a bit about his holy character and his sovereignty. Moshe's commissioning would involve Yah imbuing, bestowing upon him his authority, his power, for purposes of delivering the Hebrew nation out of the land of Egypt, Mitzrayim, and into Canaan, the promised land. Now, much of the conversation that took place between Moses and Jehovah on the mountain of Elohim, the Mount Sinai, involved Moses or Moshe expressing to Yah every excuse he could come up with why he was not the man for the job. But Yah had already, probably before he was even born, established that Moshe was indeed the man for the job. Yah had in fact chosen Moshe for this task prior to his historic meeting. He already knew Moshe's strengths and deficiencies, despite Moshe's thinking he has to outline these deficiencies to Yah because he figures Yah may not know, so I'll tell him. Well, Yah has it already figured out. He knows every strand of hair on our heads. So he already knew Moshe's strengths and deficiencies. And so Moshe was essentially kicking at the prick, if you will. Just as Yeshua mentioned to Shaul on the road to Damascus, and that is recorded in Acts chapter 9, verse 5. Why are you kicking against the prick, Paul? In other words, you can't fight me. You can't resist me. I have this already figured out, and you are the man for the job. And this is the same thing he's telling. Yah's telling Moshe. But we acknowledged in our discussion back then that this incident was just another example of the very thing that most of us come into this faith of ours experiencing or playing out or acting out. We kick against the true commissioning of Yah to work for him and his kingdom. We revolt, we push back, we reject the commissionings that we've been given for various reasons. Some of those reasons are genuine. We have concerns. We feel that we're not the man or the woman for the job, and so we don't want to be made a fool out of, if you will. So we tell Yah that we just don't believe we're the right person for the job. But then the other most likely reason is we just are lazy. We don't want to burden ourselves with doing the work of the kingdom. We rather be bench warmers. We rather just sit in our home on Sabbaths and read Torah. We rather just listen to podcasts. And please don't get me wrong. I'm so happy you're listening to this podcast. Please don't stop listening. Please don't stop reading our content. Please don't stop watching our videos. But this is what so many brethren in the faith do, beloved. They come into the faith. They're so believing of the tenets of the faith. They are so hungry for the word, but that's where it all stops. They don't want to share the word. They don't want to be a part of the kingdom work. They just want to fill the minimum. They just want to meet the minimum, which is really not a minimum because Yah doesn't have minimums. Yah demands everything from us. He demands our time. He demands our brain space, the amount of work and space we have in our brain. He demands our actions and our strength and our talents and all these things from us. He doesn't just choose us, elect us to just sit in a pew or to just sit on our couches or in our beds and just soak up his word and do nothing with it. He has commissioned each of us for a great task. And those tasks, that commissioning is even of greater importance now as we approach these dark days ahead. But getting back to what I was just saying, ultimately, Yah convinces Moshe, as he does us, that Yah's way is the only way. Yah's commissioning is the only commission that we need to be involved in this life. Yeah, we have other responsibilities. We have work responsibilities. We have family responsibilities. We have community responsibilities. We have personal responsibilities. Those are responsibilities that we have to fit into our overarching commission and responsibility, which is to Yah and to his kingdom. And with Yah's Holy Spirit, we have all that we need, all of the resources, all of the wherewithals to accomplish all of our responsibilities with great, great success. So Yah convinces Moses that his commission is the thing that he must do. And it's to his detriment, Moses' detriment, to reject the call and commissioning. And we're going to see that even more so in our reading today as this story continues. So, as the story goes, Moshe goes to his father-in-law, Jethro, or Yethro, however, whatever translation and Hebraic rendering you have before you. And he receives his father's blessing to go, his father-in-law's blessing, to go down to Egypt and see to his people, see to their welfare. I don't know to what degree Moshe shared his experiences with his father-in-law. I would imagine he shared a great deal because we know that Jethro was a Cohen, a priest of Midian, and he had knowledge of Yah. So it's possible that Moshe shared his commissioning, the experience of his commissioning up there on the mount with the so-called burning bush, that great sight that was talked about. We talked about that to some great degree last posting. And this is where our reading picks up this week. And I want to focus only on verses 22 through 26, which reads as follows. If you have your Bible, we're in chapter 4, and we're going to be reading verses 22 through 26 of the 4th chapter. And I will be reading from the New English Translation. So if your reading seems a little different from mine, well, that's why, because I'm using the NET translation of this passage. Beginning at verse 22. And this is Yah speaking to Moshe. He says to Moshe, "You must say to Pharaoh, 'Thus says the Lord, thus says Jehovah, Yishrael is my son, my firstborn. Now pay attention and keep that in mind, because this is going to be somewhat important in our understanding of the overall story contained in our reading. So he tells Moshe, you're going to say to Pharaoh, Israel is my son, he's my firstborn. Continuing to verse 23. And I said to you, this is Yah saying to Moshe, sort of in this playing out of what's going to happen. Abba knows already ahead of time how Pharaoh is going to react to Moshe, telling him, you're going to have to let Yah's people go. You're going to have to let the Hebrews go. Well, Yah's playing this scenario out, and he says, I said to you, I, being Moshe, I said to you, Pharaoh, let my son go that he may serve me. But since you have refused to let him go, him being Yishrael, Yah's firstborn, I will surely kill your son, Pharaoh, your firstborn, Pharaoh. Verse 24. Now on the way, now we're getting into the narrative of the story. Yah's done commissioning and instructing Moshe on his task. Now, the passage here in verse 24 talks about Moshe getting on with his task, starting his journey. The text reads, now on the way, at a place where they stopped for the night, they being Moshe, Zipporah, his wife, and his son or sons. We're not quite sure how many, but we'll get into that discussion in just a minute. But on the way, at a place where they stopped for the night, some English translations say an inn, I-N-N, a hotel, motel, YMCA, whatever. They stopped overnight. The Lord, Jehovah, met Moses and sought to kill him. Verse 25. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off the foreskin of her son, and touched it to Moses' feet, and said, quote, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me, end quote. And lastly, verse 26, so the Lord, Jehovah, let him alone, him being Moshe. At that time, she said, she being Zipporah, and here it gets repeated again, a bridegroom of blood, referring to the circumcision. And I will tell you that this is one of the most difficult and mysterious passages to be found in all of Torah, if you ask me. For everything that took place leading up to our focus verses makes perfect sense, at least to me. But here in this passage, we run into an event that makes little sense. Let's break it down. Let's break down some of the component parts of our focus reading. First part. Moses, received some last-minute instructions from Yah regarding the very words he was to say to Pharaoh related to the release of Moshe's people from Egyptian or Mitzri bondage. Quote, thus says Jehovah, Yishrael is my son, my firstborn. Let my son Yishrael go that he may serve me. But because you've refused to let my firstborn son go, Pharaoh, I will kill your son, even your firstborn son. Verses 22 and 23. Second component part. It would then appear that Moshe, along with his young family, stopped along the way to Egypt or Mitzrayim at an inn or a hotel or whatever they had, some rest area. It's uncertain. And I'll tell you, I'm pretty surprised that there was such a thing back in that day. A hotel, an inn in the middle of the wilderness, I guess on the highway and byway heading from Midian to to Egypt. I don't know, but I guess we should never underestimate the power of commerce. Even around 1500 BCE in the middle of a desert, someone is going to be out there making $1.00. I guess there are people who are constantly going to and fro from Egypt and so forth. So they need a place to hang out and rest overnight. So, of course, there might be an inn. But in the midst of Moshe's family stopping for the night, the text tells us that Jehovah met Moshe. Jehovah met Moshe and sought to kill him. Verse 24. What? Wait a minute. Yah just commissions Moshe to lead the greatest relocation of Yah's people in all of human history. Relocate them out of Egypt and into the promised land. Some estimates say upwards of 3 million people. And here we find previously in Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections number 47, Yah hires or he commissions Moshe to lead this group out of Egypt to Canaan. But in the very next minute, here in our Torah reading today, Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections 48, he seeks to take Moses out. He seeks to kill Moshe. Why? Well, maybe the following verses will clear up the mystery. Third component, Zipporah, realizing the existential threat to Moshe's life, she takes a piece of flint and circumcises her son, or at least one of her sons, verse 25. Depending on the translations you read, there is an indication that there was more than one son that went on this trip. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. So we know that Moshe had a son named Gershom, while other translations in Jewish tradition assert that the couple had two sons, Gershom and Eleazar, Eleazar being the youngest one. And so, interestingly, it is held in some Jewish teachings that the couple did in fact have a second son on the way to Egypt or Mitzrayim. And of course, the name was Eleazar, and that it was Eleazar who had not been circumcised by Moses, because circumcision of infants in the wilderness and on journeys was believed to present an existential threat to the life of the infant. And this is outlined in some of the Talmudic writings, and I have the reference in the show's transcript of this post for your convenience, if you're so interested, just so you know I'm not making this stuff up. And so in that case, Moses is believed to have put off circumcising Eleazar for whatever reason. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But other Jewish thinkers such as Ramban or Maimonides and Saidi ben Yosef Gaon, who was a 10th century BCE Arabic rabbi. I didn't know they had Arabic rabbis back in the day, but I guess they did. But this Saidi ben Yosef Gaon, well, along with Rambam or Maimonides, they remained steadfast in their belief that it was Gershom alone that Moshe had neglected to circumcise, which again, assuming this was the central issue that led Moshe being nearly killed, It would be consistent with the content of verses 22 and 23 of our reading, where Yah talks to Moshe about Yisrael being his firstborn and Pharaoh's firstborn son being killed because Pharaoh would not let Yah's firstborn son go. Firstborn seems to be an important consideration here. And this issue of Moshe possibly neglecting to circumcise his own firstborn after being commissioned by Yah to lead the great nation Yisrael, whom Yah called his firstborn son, out of Mitzri bondage, and to bring Yisrael into a covenant relationship with the creator of the universe, all the while Moshe had, for whatever reason, decided not to circumcise his firstborn son in violation of the Abrahamic covenant, provisions of the Abrahamic covenant. It would have been scandalous. It would have been disrespectful to not only Yah, the giver of the Abrahamic covenant, but also to the very Hebrews Moshe, was commissioned to lead out of Egypt and onto the promised land. So imagine the questions, imagine the conflict that would erupt against Moshe once the people discovered that he'd not circumcised his own firstborn son. He being the chosen leader, the grand poobah, and he'd not circumcised his firstborn son? He's the chosen leader of the nation? He's supposed to be setting the example for us, and he didn't do what the covenant demands that he does? It could have erupted into a problematic situation, and maybe Yah set about to make sure that Moshe would not put himself and the nation into such a precarious situation. And I personally believe that Yah instructed Moshe to circumcise his son prior to the start of the family's journey to Egypt or Mitzrayim. But Moshe, for whatever reason, failed to obey Yah's command. But again, this is Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections. We are still thinking and reflecting on these amazing things and allowing Yah's Ruach, his spirit, to speak to us as Yah sees fit. But regardless, Zipporah circumcises one of her sons, whether it's Gershom or Eliezer. The text does not say. And she throws or places the circumcised foreskin of her son. Some translations, such as the NET that I use here, says that she touched Moshe's feet with her son's circumcised foreskin. Now, other translations leave out entirely that the foreskin was put in the vicinity of Moshe's feet altogether. As an aside, the Hebrew word that is normally used to describe the act of circumcision, mule, is not used to describe that which Zipporah did to her son, but rather the Hebrew term used here is karath or karath, which means to cut. Now, Messianic Torah and Torah teacher, author Tim Haig, in his commentary on this passage, well, he suggests that there exists some parallels with Zipporah's act of using a flint stone to circumcise her son, to cut off her son's foreskin, with this parallel with the Hebrew expression for making a covenant, which in Hebrew is karat barit, or to cut a covenant. And add to this thinking the thinking that the blood that was spilled from the circumcision had the same effect as the blood that would be smeared or applied over the Hebrews' doorpost in Egypt or Mitzrayim for purposes of staving off the death angel that would go through the land of Egypt and take the life of Egyptians' firstborn. The blood of the firstborn staving off the death angel, presuming it was indeed a death angel. That's what I propose. It was a death angel. The translations say that Yah went through and killed the firstborn, but I would think it may have been a death angel or an angel assigned to take the life. But staving off the death angel and saving Moses or Moshe from certain death. And Haig here suggests that Zipporah's statement of, quote, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me, end quote, to either, it's been directed to either Moshe or her circumcised son or Jehovah. Well, it could have implied that it was the blood of their son's circumcision that brought about Moshe's salvation. The angel staving the angel's killing of her husband Moshe. So her statement here is one of those great mysteries that we can only speculate about, but it certainly gives us material to think and reflect upon. None of what we've said here regarding her statement and regarding her actions is solid, because there's so much that's left out of the narrative, and we can only piece things together based upon what we have before us. The fourth part or element of our reading is that which Zipporah did to one of her sons clearly stopped the execution death of her husband Moshe. For the text states that Jehovah let him, Moshe, alone in verse 26. But the text once more records Zipporah's statement that, quote, you are a bridegroom of blood, end quote. Let's look at some of the possibilities surrounding our passage. This portion of Moshe's journey to lead his people to freedom is indeed mysterious, and because so much of the story is left out, there are so many holes that need to be filled in. It's virtually impossible to sort out exactly what was happening here. What would cause Jehovah? What would cause Yah, who just a few hours or days ago commissioned Yah for the task of leading the Hebrew nation out of the Egyptian bondage and onto freedom in Canaan, now seeking to execute his chosen one? To be honest, there aren't too many possibilities to consider here. A, Yah or one of his Malak or angels intercepts Moshe at the inn, the hotel, motel that they were staying in, that is on the path towards Egypt, and intends to kill him for an unspecified reason. B, a divine creature, possibly an agent of the enemy, Hasatan, knowing the mission Moshe was on, intercepts Moshe with the intent of killing him in anticipation of halting the exodus of the Hebrew nation out of Egypt, out of Mitzrayim. And this is actually mentioned in Jubilees, the book of Jubilees, chapter 48, which, again, I think is rabbinic gibberish. I don't necessarily believe that, but I'll leave it at that. I guess there's a reason why these apocryphal books aren't considered as sacred, as part of canon, because a lot of times they contradict what our 66 special says. Our 66 book special says Jehovah met Moshe and sought to kill him. Jehovah met, Yah met, Jehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah met Moshe. It didn't say, well, in that passage I actually read it, Mastema. Mastema is this evil angel that is often used by Yah to Well, he is a bad person. He is actually on the side of Hasatan, and he goes about doing all kinds of bad things. And in this case, what Yovelim or Jubilees is saying is that this Mastema character was sent by somebody, either Hasatan or that prince. He's considered a prince, by the way, a prince angel. And he was sent to stop Moses from executing his mission in Egypt, if you want to believe that. But that, to me, conflicts with what our Exodus, our Shemot passage says. And it was, according to Jubilees, that it was the circumcision of Eleazar that stopped this Mastema from killing Moses. But if you want to go with that, that's fine. But for me, I really have some doubt as to the validity of that. But the most widely accepted theory in both Judaism and denominationalism is that Yah, or perhaps this angel of the Lord, this Malach Yehovah, intercepted Moshe at the inn, at this hotel or motel on the way to Egypt, and that it was Yah's intent to kill Moshe. Interestingly, verse 24 of the Onkelos is a rabbinic interpretation of Torah written in the 1st century of the Common Era. That translation reads as follows: "And it was in the way, at the place of lodging, that the angel of the Lord met him and sought to kill him." The Septuagint, or the LXX, reads of that verse 24, "And it came to pass that the angel of the Lord met him by the way in the inn and sought to slay him." Now, Rashi, also known as Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchakai, who was a medieval French rabbi and contributor to the Talmud, takes what I believe to be an extreme flight of fantasy here, and he writes about this supposed angel turning into a serpent and swallowing Moshe whole, and that it fell to Zipporah, his wife, to circumcise their son Eleazar, who was the youngest of the two sons, in order to halt Moshe's death. That, beloved, is pure rabbinic gibberish. But this is what some folks believe this passage is all about. This is some of the details that the rabbis of old have filled in that were missing. That's the problem when we have this temptation by some to add to the missing elements. They just come up with these amazing things. But some believe that the reason Yah, or the angel of Jehovah, intended to kill Moshe was that Moshe was dragging his feet and had not carried out a commandment that had been given to him. And that it was this dragging of his feet, his procrastination in not accomplishing the given commandment or task, that incited the ire of Yah. So, what could that assignment, that task, that commandment have been? It's possible that verses 22 and 23 provide us an important clue to this mystery. In these verses, Yah instructs Moshe to tell Pharaoh that because he had refused to release Yah's first son, this is looking ahead a few months or weeks, because Pharaoh refused to release Yah's firstborn son, Yisrael, from Egyptian or Mitzri bondage, then Pharaoh's firstborn son would die. And then we immediately get into the mysterious circumcision situation in the very next verse, verse 24. Could that which Moshe had neglected or put off doing been connected with something Yah had tasked him to do, or to do to his son, Gershom, or Eleazar? Could it have been something that Moshe had put off doing until he decided to get around to doing it? Could that assignment or task or commandment have been to circumcise his son? J.H. Hertz, author of Torah and Haftarah, suggests that Moshe, because he'd failed to outright refused to circumcise his son, even his firstborn son Gershom, was the thing that resulted in Moshe falling into a dire illness. And why would a failure on Moshe's part in circumcising his son have led to him being killed by Yah, or the angel of Yah? Well, we know from previous Torah studies that circumcision was a critical element of the Abrahamic covenant. And we find this in Genesis chapter 17. We're going to look at verses 9 through 14. Genesis 17, verses 9 through 14. And the KJV, the King James Version, reads, verse 9, "And God, Yah, said to Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. Thou shalt keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, in all their generations." Verse 10, "This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your seed after you." And here's the kicker here. "Every man child among you shall be circumcised." Every man child, every male child among you shall be circumcised. Verse 11, "And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin." And here's another part that we need to pay attention to. "And it shall be a token of the covenant between me and you." So the ritual of circumcision was a token. It would serve as a token of the covenant between Yah and Yisrael, between Yah and the male Yisrael child. Verse 12, "And he that is 8 days old," this is important, "he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man child in your generations. He that is born in the house or bought with money of any stranger, which is not of your seed." So at 8 days old, every male Hebrew child is to be circumcised. And this is supposed to go down from Abraham all throughout the generations of the Hebrews. Verse 13, "He that is born in your house and he that is bought with your money must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant." And lastly, verse 14, and this is the kicker, "And the uncircumcised man-child, the uncircumcised boy, the uncircumcised male infant, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, well, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant." Again, that was Genesis chapter 17, verses 9 through 14. Clearly, any Hebrew that broke this element of the covenant would be subject to being cut off from the house of Israel. And being cut off from one's people can be manifested in either the community of Israel physically ejecting the violator of the covenant. In this case, the violator of the covenant would have to be the father of the uncircumcised child, and maybe even the child himself. Or the cutting off may be manifested in Yah himself cutting off that soul, that is, ending that soul's life. In this case, the responsible soul would be Moses, assuming this was a case of Moshe not circumcising his son, and so violating the terms of the covenant, making him subject to being cut off from his people. So let's look at some traditional reasons why Moshe broke covenant. Unnamed rabbinic sources suggest that Midian, or Bedouin ritual circumcision practices involved their sons being circumcised in their 13th year, which is an extreme contradiction to Torah circumcision instructions, which had sons of Yisrael circumcised on the 8th day of their lives. What does Midian or Bedouin religious or ritual practices have to do with Moshe? Well, Moshe's father-in-law, Yitro, was the Cohen or priest of Midian, and this is noted in Exodus, Shemot chapter 2, verse 16. Moshe married Yitro's daughter, Zipporah. So it's likely that Moshe, being a man without a country, had decided to live as a Midianite, which would mean that he gave into and followed his wife Zipporah's or his father-in-law Jethro's way of life, which meant that he raised his son or sons in the Midianite ways. So it seems quite reasonable to surmise that maybe Moshe's reasoning for not circumcising his son in accordance with Yah's covenant instruction had to do with this conflict in cultures. Maybe Hebrew versus Midianite. And it's unclear, given the severe lack of clarity or clarifying information in the text. And I would submit that maybe Yah intended it to be this way, this vagueness, this uncertainty in the text to force us, the readers of Torah, to think these things through. Not so much that we attempt to fill in the missing elements to the various stories and teachings that Torah provides, but rather that we contemplate the meaning. Think, reflect on the meaning, the importance, and the multitudinous facets that make up Yah's Torah and the original covenants. The book of Jasher supports the thinking that Moshe failed to circumcise his son, in particular Gershom, because Yitro convinced Moshe that he shouldn't, for an unspecified reason. And this is found in Jasher chapter 78. The other thing to consider in thinking about and reflecting on the possibilities of Moshe not circumcising his son or sons in accordance with the provisions of the covenant is the instructions that Yah gave to Moshe regarding Pharaoh. Yah tells Moshe, "You tell Pharaoh that because you refuse to let my son Yisrael go, there will be dire consequences involving your son." In other reasons offered as to why Moshe may have broken covenant has to do with the dangers associated with circumcising an infant while on a journey in ancient times. Apparently, subjecting an infant to circumcision while on a journey back in the day in the wilderness could result in the infant's death. So some thoughtful rabbis introduced such a practical theory to explain why such a man as Moshe would have neglected to circumcise Gershom or Eleazar. Again, assuming that a failure to circumcise his sons was the reason Moshe almost lost his life. Interestingly, it was Zipporah who circumcised the couple's son, not Moshe. And this is certainly an eyebrow raiser, if you ask me, as it always fell to the father to see to it that his 8-year-old son was circumcised by the appropriate leader of the tribe, in accordance with the stipulated provisions of the covenant. Let's come around and look at this statement, bridegroom of blood. So, what did Zipporah mean by her statement? Either directed towards Moshe, either directed to Yehovah, or directed to her newly circumcised son, that individual was a bridegroom of blood to her. I'll tell you right now, Zipporah's statement regarding someone being a bridegroom of blood to her is not supported by any other scriptural mention in the whole of Scripture. And for any of us to say what that statement meant would be pure speculation on our part. There's nothing wrong with speculating, but when we stand on it as complete, unadulterated truth, that's when it becomes a problem. We have to always keep in mind that we're probably wrong and that there's another reason that is true. So we have to be humble when we go into this. Too many of us get into these things and we state things as pure fact. And we don't have biblical support for that. That's when you're starting to read into things. Eisegesis, I mentioned back in the previous installment. This idea of reading into the text is not the best way to study Scripture. Sometimes we cannot avoid engaging in eisegenic studies. We add things to things, but we have to always keep in mind that we have to have an open mind for one thing, and we have to also keep in mind that we're probably incorrect. So we do the best we can, but we allow the Scripture to tell us the truth of the matter. And at the end of the day, it's probably best to just come to the conclusion that we just don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. But the phrase bridegroom of blood in the Hebrew is katan damim. Katan damim. Now, one rabbinic way of explaining this phrase or statement of Zipporah is to attach it to the ritual of circumcision, which is a sign of the covenant between the son, Yisrael, and his father, Yehovah. That being the case, the son may be considered the bridegroom of the covenant. I've thought long and hard on this explanation about Yisrael being the bridegroom of the covenant, but I cannot make heads or tails on this thinking. And I personally doubt that this is a plausible explanation for the phrase bridegroom of blood. But we have Ibn Ezra, also known as Abraham ben Meir ibn Ezra, who was a middle-aged Jewish biblical commentator and philosopher, who proposed that Zipporah's statement was directed towards her newly circumcised son. In other words, according to Ibn Ezra, in Zipporah making such a statement, bridegroom of blood, it was her son and her uncircumcised his uncircumcised state that almost led to Zipporah's husband, Moshe, being killed by Yehovah. Okay, well, I will say that Ezra's explanation contradicts the conventional understanding of this passage, that the statement was directed to Moshe by an exasperated Zipporah who had to see her husband almost killed, and in order to save his life, being forced to circumcise their son. I don't know. Again, there isn't enough background information to say either way, I'm afraid. Remember, Rashi's contribution to this discussion just a few moments ago, well, he suggested that Zipporah's statement to her son, her newly circumcised son, was one of her stating to her son that it was he that heard or that caused her bridegroom, Moshe, to almost be killed. You, Gershom, you, Eliezer, are the slayer of my bridegroom. Again, this is laid out in a Talmudic post that I've given reference to in this post transcript for your convenience. This, I would hope you would agree, is interesting stuff. In this case, this makes the most sense out of any other explanations of the phrase that I've run across or that I myself can come up with. That it is Zipporah who is going through an emotional hell and torment watching her husband die, and she looks upon her son who was uncircumcised, and she places the blame on her son's uncircumcised state as the reason for her almost losing her bridegroom, her husband, Moshe. And so the statement, bridegroom of blood, is directed to Gershom or Eleazar, whoever it is. Again, we don't know what we don't know. Was Zipporah's statement brought on by issues beyond the near-death incident, maybe? Were they having marital strife? Maybe her statement was directed to Moshe because she was angry at him for putting her through. Was what she was being put through? Was Zipporah and Moshe in disagreement maybe over Moshe's commission to go down to Egypt and lead the Hebrews out of Egypt? Did Moshe even tell Zipporah what his mission was? What unrecorded conversations did Moshe have with Jehovah prior to this incident? Did Jehovah maybe instruct Moshe to circumcise his son before embarking on the mission, and Moshe putting off the task, which I personally think is what happened? I don't take for granted that Yah did not tell Moshe, look, before you go on this journey, you need to circumcise your son. You need to be up to snuff with the covenant provisions. I don't think Yah left it to chance, because Zipporah knew immediately what needed to be done to save her husband's life. She immediately acted to circumcise her. So she had this understanding that her son, uncircumcised condition, was causing the issue with her husband almost dying. So I believe that was at the forefront of the couple's mind. And maybe Moshe even told Zipporah, look, I'm not in good standing with the father. He wants me to circumcise our son. And maybe, who knows, maybe Zipporah said, well, I would rather we not. And maybe Moshe gave into the not and didn't circumcise. And father said, no, it's not going to be that way. You're going to circumcise your son. You're going to do it my way, or you're going to do it my way. And turns out that things were done his way. But I think that's probably the line of thinking. But again, we don't know what we don't know. This is pure speculation on my part. It's definitely eisegenic in nature, reading into the text. And so I take it with a grain of salt, even my perspectives. But these are purely thoughts and reflections on our Torah reading. And so when Moshe chose, for whatever reason, not to comply with Yah's instructions, then Yah sought to hold Moshe responsible for the violation of covenant that he just committed. Yah was in effect cutting Moshe off from his people through this incident. In him subjecting Moshe to near death, Yah was effectively carrying out his promise. You will be cut off from your people. Okay, enough speculation and eisegesis here. Let's get into practical messianic halakha, walking out the things that we're able to draw from our Torah reading. What is the practical point behind our Torah reading? There is so much to draw from this Torah reading, especially from the brief passage we've examined and discussed here today. I think you would all agree. If we are correct in our assessment, let's just assume we're correct in our assessment that Moshe failed to circumcise one of his sons, and it took Zipporah circumcising her son in order to save her husband's life, then I would say that obedience to Yah's instructions is central to the lesson we're to take from this reading. Obedience to Yah's instructions and obedience to the provisions of the covenant, despite how irrelevant those instructions and provisions may seem to us at any given time. Clearly, even the seeming small things of our covenant relationship matters to Yah. Let me repeat that. Even the seeming small things of our covenant relationship matters immensely to Yah. and to not have that sense of urgency, that sense of meticulousness within us to walk out and carry out those instructions and provisions can cause problems in our covenant relationship with Yah. For Yah expects us to pay close attention to his instructions and the provisions of the covenant and walk out those provisions and instructions to the very best of our ability. To refuse, to neglect to do so can have unsavory consequences, as we've seen illustrated in our reading here today. And that's why it behooves us to petition Yah often in our prayers, that he show us the areas in our lives and in our walk that are lacking, so that we may, through the assistance of his Ruach HaKodesh, his Holy Spirit, make the appropriate corrections, effectively and properly fulfill the provisions of the covenant, and walk before Yah blamelessly. Nothing as it relates to Yah's instructions and covenant provisions is too small or too nebulous to Yah, and neither should they be to us. I would imagine, assuming that the issue at hand in our reading was Moshe's failure to circumcise his son, that Moshe viewed the circumcising of his son as a small thing, that it was a task or something that could be put off to a more convenient time, especially given the enormity of the task and commission facing him. But in Yah's eyes, breakage of the covenant provisions, such as circumcision of all sons of Yisrael on the 8th day, was an important, or I should say, was as important as Moshe's commission to go down to Egypt and lead Yah's people out of Egyptian bondage and on to the promised land. As important as that commission. And so, as it applies to us, regardless the major and not so major things we face each day in our lives, we must always be cognizant of our responsibilities as it relates to our covenant relationship with Yahovah, and not neglect those provisions and instructions such as steadfast prayer, tithing, loving the brethren, keeping Yah's set-apart days to the best of our understanding and abilities, loving our spouses and not neglecting them, keeping our hearts circumcised, trusting Yah, taking care of our health and treating these bodies of ours as sacred temples in which Yah dwells, to always image Yah in our day-to-day lives, not bringing ourselves and Yah to shame by acting fools or acting as fools, to be a blessing to others who are in need. And I'm sure you can make your own list. And we all should constantly seek Yah's Spirit to conduct a frequent and thorough search of our hearts to ensure we are in compliance with the provisions of our covenant relationship with Yah. You know, we can always expect Yah's best for our lives and the lives we will have in his coming kingdom. He always gives us his best. And so, in return, Yah expects the very best from each of us, always. It's only reasonable for us to give him our best, to give full attention to the provisions and instructions of the covenant that we have with him, and not let things go. And yes, even the small things matter to Yah. Definitely the weightier matters of the covenant and Torah matter, but also the small things. Master said to the Pharisees, look, you focus on these things, but you also need to do these other things. So we are responsible for everything, the weightier ones as well as the less weightier ones. Yah doesn't overlook anything. So let us keep our eyes on the prize and always look upwards as our redemption draws ever so closer each passing day, beloved. I pray and trust that you will have an overcoming week, and that as always, you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Take care, and until next time.